Okay, sir. I think
ಶುರು ಮಾಡಬಹುದಲ್ಲ?
We'll start, sir. We'll start.
Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome all of you to the BNET webinar series. Today we have the webinar on headache, learning headache through cases. It has been a wonderful journey for last 8 to 9 months, where we had a series of webinars on various topics, starting from the peripheral nerve to the brain. We can look at all the aspects of neurology has been almost covered. For today's webinar, we are lucky to have Professor B. Nataraju, who is the HOD of Vaidehi Medical College at Bengaluru, very dear friend and senior colleague of mine. Thank you, sir. Thank you for accepting our invitation and coming here to chair the session. Yes, sir. I think I will let you take over the session and conduct the session. If you have any requirement, let us know. We'll help you out.
Yeah, thank you for that nice introduction. Good evening to all. I was Professor HOD of Neurology at Vaidehi, but I have since resigned from May last year. I'm now just freewheeling. Today we have an interesting session of the BNET for learning headache through cases. Of course, learning neurology itself is through cases. Otherwise, it will be learning to sail without going to the seas. We all have been taught that you learn neurology stroke by stroke. And we can also say we learn headache by headache. Okay, every patient is a headache to the doctor, and every vertigo patient is an attack of giddiness to the doctor. So first up is young Dr. Rohit, the resident from St. John's Medical College. He will be presenting and discussing a case of headache in a young lady. So Dr. Rohit, you can go ahead.
Yes, thank you, sir. Is my screen visible to everybody?
Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. Today, I'll be presenting about types of headache in our case, in a young lady who has presented with various types of headaches, and what were our practical problems, and how did we manage it. So history goes like this, dated back to May 2019. She's a 23-year-old female who works as a BPO for outsourcing department. And then she presented with new onset headache for past 4 days. So headache was sudden in onset. It rapidly progressed over hours and peaked by night. It was throbbing type, continuous and severe intensity. And if you look at the pain scale, she has given a rating of 8 out of 10. So never she had this headache before, and she presented with new onset headache. The question, please. So this lady who has presented with this new onset headache for the past 4 days, and then severe continuous. So what would be your plan of action? Whether you want to treat her as a primary headache, or do you want to give her reassurance, analgesics and follow, or would you like to evaluate for secondary causes? Okay, the answer is would like to evaluate for the secondary causes. So the red flag is that any patient who presents with new onset headache, which is abrupt, which is sudden and new onset, needs to be evaluated first. So that's what we have done. So further description goes on like this. The headache increases on bending of neck and cough. I would have presented this in the previous slides, but when I present this slide, I think most of the people would know the answer. So I thought I will just give the question in the beginning itself. So the patient also had associated vomiting, which is 1 to 2 episodes per day, which is non-projectile, non-bilious. There was no photophonophobia, no diplopia or giddiness, no loss of consciousness or seizures. There is no fever, cold or cough. She was on OCP usage for the menorrhagia for the past 2 to 3 months. Examination wise, there was pallor, there is no papilledema on fundoscopy, there is no PNS tenderness, and no other deficits were noticed. So our clinical impression, we have kept it as new onset headache and probably secondary cause of headache, or one of the causes may be new migraine may also be a possibility, but still we wanted to evaluate for the secondary headache. So it warranted evaluation anyway. So we have done the MRI, which was like this. So it was showing a diffusion restriction in the right temporal lobe, and then there were mixed intensities in the right temporal lobe with mass effect. And when we went on with the MR venogram, it showed loss of flow voids in the bilateral internal jugular veins and sigmoid sinuses. So the GRE sequences showed a loss of flow voids at the sigmoidotransverse junction on the right side and blooming in the right temporal lobe. So when we went to the investigations, so there was severe anemia, iron deficiency anemia with hemoglobin of 5.5 and then a PCV of 19.7, and peripheral smear was showing a microcytic hypochromic anemia. And the other workup related to the CVT we have done, APL and homocysteine were normal. B12, she was already supplemented outside, so it turned out to be normal. So our working diagnosis was cerebral sinus venous thrombosis with vena involving the vine of Lebe territory. And the cause, we thought it will be because of OCV usage and anemia. And she was treated with anticoagulation, anti-edema measures, and anti-epileptics, and she has improved. And later on, when she came to the follow-up, she was better. The headache has come down significantly. But she lost her job and had a lot of social problems. And she used to get episodic headaches with stress lasting for 30 to 60 minutes. And pain scale this time she rated 4 to 5 out of 10. And it was localized to bilateral frontotemporal region and the frequency being 6 to 7 times per month. So with these kind of symptoms, now we thought it might be a tension type of headache. And then we have treated with tricyclic antidepressants and she improved. And also she was continued with anti-epileptics and warfarin. And then she was followed up again. So later when she came back after 6 months, that is in December 2019, we have repeated a scan again, which was showing a gliosis in the right temporal lobe in the vein of Lebe territory. And she is improved very well. And then we have stopped the warfarin, and after 1 month, we have done the procoagulant workup like protein C, S, antithrombin 3, factor 5 Leiden mutations, which turned out to be negative. And then we have treated her like a tension type headache, and we have followed up. And she followed up with us till February, and then lost the follow from March till July. So this lady had 2 types of headache till now. One is headache secondary to the CVT, and then followed by the headache, which is of tension type. So she was doing well, and next we saw her. She landed up in our emergency in July 18th, 2020, again with headache for the past 2 days, and then fever since 2 days, and seizure for 1 day, seizure on the next day. So headache was holocranial in nature this time. It was mild to moderate in intensity, lasted for 30 minutes, and is episodic, which is 2 to 3 times per day. And headache increased on bending of neck, and then no vomiting or photophonophobia. Fever lasted for 1 day, which was high grade and associated with chills. There was no cough or burning micturition or rash because we thought it may be secondary to the systemic infection. And the next day, she had 5 episodes of focal seizures, which were initially left focal, leading to bilateral tonic-clonic. So after taking the history, she said that she has discontinued the anti-epileptics in the February itself. And again, we have checked for the fundoscopy. There was no papilledema. So these were her regular the routine investigations which I have done. The hemoglobin was again 6.5 grams, and which was suggestive of iron deficiency. And then urine showed routine showed multiple WBCs, and then urine culture showed E. coli. So we have done an ultrasound which was only showing polycystic ovaries. And she has come during the time of COVID. So we have done the RT-PCR, which was negative. So since she has come again with the new onset headache with the increased intensity again, and then associated fever was there and breakthrough seizures. We thought we will repeat the MRI again, and which was showing a diffusion restriction in the right medial temporal and right frontal. And so that's it. So again, if you take the gradient images and the contrast also we have repeated because there was signal changes in the right frontal lobe. So question 2, please. So what will be your likely diagnosis in this case? So is it a glioma, a cortical vein thrombosis, or postictal signal changes? Yeah, the answer is cortical vein thrombosis, and also postictal signal changes were also there in the right medial temporal, if you notice. So 2 answers can be considered. So if you look at this GRE, there is a slight blooming in the right frontal region. So it is of the cortical vein. So we have considered this as cortical vein thrombosis. So since the APLA homocysteine and our negative procoagulant was negative, and she was having severe anemia, again, we thought it to be of severe iron deficiency anemia. And we have given the correction with iron, and antiepileptics were restarted for her. So this time we have changed to dabigatran, and then tricyclic antidepressants were also continued for depression and tension type of headache. And her UTI was treated with antibiotics, and she has improved. So follow-up after 1 week, she has significantly improved. Her headache has improved, but still continued to have this headaches of lasting for 30 to 60 minutes. And she had lack of sleep, and she also started having death wishes. And we again considered this to be of tension type headache, and we have continued, and we have adjusted the medications. So she went back, and later again after 20 days, she landed in emergency again. So with 1 episode of breakthrough seizure, she was compliant to the medication this time, and headache was persistent. And she had again a fever this time, which lasted for 2 days, and vomiting for 1 day. So we have reassessed the case. She reported to have a financial and family issues, and then headache was still episodic with severe in intensity, lasting for 30 to 60 minutes, and no photophonophobia, diplopia. Headache increased on bending of neck, and this time also the fundus revealed no papilledema. So we again thought it may be because of the systemic illness, and also previously she used to have recurrent UTIs. So thought it might be because of the urinary tract infection and fever. So this is the repeat CT on the same day which we have done. So if you look at the CT brain, there was a good amount of resolution in the right frontal lobe, and also there was gliotic changes in the right temporal. So MRI could not be done because of the financial constraints. So the routine blood investigations were normal this time. Hemoglobin improved to 9, and then urine routine still shows pustules, and cultures were showing of Candida species. So she was treated both with antibiotics and antifungals. Fluconazole we have added. So all was going well for her, and she was improving. And then, however, on 6th day of admission, again the fever reoccurred. And she again had the seizure in the hospital itself. It's the same kind of semialgia, which was a left focal leading to bilateral tonic-clonic. And she became drowsy, and drowsiness was persisting. And her headache became worse in this at this time. And she was shifted to ITU, and she was monitored. So antibiotics were escalated, and this time clobazam was added. The following day, she was still drowsy, and a headache continued to be there, which was relieved only on analgesics. And then this time, we found that she was found to have a neck stiffness. So again, we have checked for the fundus, and then this time it revealed a bilateral papilledema, and then she was shifted for imaging immediately. So on the imaging on the same day, this was the imaging of the patient, and then we were surprised to see the images. The lady who was presenting with episodic headaches, which was thought to be of tension type, and then who used to have fever on and off for the past 2 to 3 weeks, thought to be because of UTI, now showed now showed communicating hydrocephalus, dilated ventricles, and then basal exudates. So this time we could not do the LP because she was already an anticoagulation, and hyponatremia was present, sodium of 130, and her total counts were 5,370, and neutrophilia predominantly. So this time we have considered this because of due to be considered it as subacute onset of fever with meningitis. So she was given a meningitic dose of ceftriaxone. ATT was started with steroids. Because she was, even though the LP could not be done, the imaging was suggestive. It was showing communicating hydrocephalus with meningitis and subacute onset of fever. And in India, think of tuberculosis. So anti-edematous measures were administered. Neurosurgery consultations were also taken, and it was followed. And her contrast MRI was also planned. And EVD was also planned, standby in case the sensorium worsened. So this is the CT brain which we have repeated after 3 days. It was showing mild increase in the hydrocephalus. However, her sensorium was preserved, well preserved. We thought we'll wait again because the sensorium is intact. And by this time, we have done the Montax, which became positive. So this is the contrast MRI we have done after 2 days, which was showing basal exudates, leptomeningitis, and hydrocephalus. And if you look at the hydrocephalus compared to the previous studies, it has reduced, and the patient has reduced to the steroids and ATT. So this time we have considered the diagnosis as a headache secondary to the tubercular meningitis. There was a dramatic improvement seen on day-to-day assessment in the hospital after starting ATT with steroids. And after 1 week, we have discharged her, and she went walking out of the hospital without any intervention. So later, she was followed up regularly, and she continued to have tension type headaches, but not as frequent and severe as previously. She was much better, and she was much better. And then follow-up scan after the 3 months. If you look at the scan, axial T2 flare, there was complete resolution of the hydrocephalus, and exudates are also not seen. So she has responded to the ATT. So coming to our case, the patient had 3 types of headaches, which was of tension type headache, initially headache secondary to the CVT, and then later on within 10 days or 20 days of interval after 20 days, she had headache secondary to the tubercular meningitis. So practical issues in our patient, she had financial constraints for imaging. She lost her job, so definitely financial constraints. We could not proceed with LP because of the anticoagulation. She had social problems. She had recurrent episodic headaches, which could deviate from the main issues. So if you look at the primary headache, that is tension type headache, so if we could have delayed the treatment, maybe she would have landed up in other complications. So always it's better to reassess the patient daily if the patient is complaining. So coming to the discussion, so tension type of headache is most common in the general population. Because of the extensive symptom overlap with secondary headache disorders and migraine, the diagnosis of TTH requires exclusion of these other conditions. Secondary headaches occur more often and may be relatively more prominent in patients with a pre-existing primary headache disorder. A clear progression in the intensity and the frequency of the primary headache should prompt a re-evaluation. Patients with a primary headache disorder are more susceptible to the development of headache when a secondary cause occurs. Therefore, a secondary cause should be considered in patients with pre-existing headache disorders who develop a significant increase in number and severity of those attacks. So red flags for the secondary headache disorders. So always think of first or worst headaches or abrupt onset headaches as red flags. Progression or a fundamental change in the pattern of headache. New headache in those younger than 5 years or older than 50 years. New headache with cancer, immunosuppression or pregnancy. headache with syncope or seizures, headache triggered by exertion, Valsalva maneuver, or sex, neurological symptoms lasting longer than 1 hour, abnormal general or neurological examination. So this is the take-home message. So always approach a case with an absolutely blank mind. Do not twist the facts to suit theorism instead of theories to suit facts. Thank you.
Nataraj sir, if you are there, can we take the questions now?
Pardon, sir, we are not able to hear you. Can you unmute?
This is unmuted. Sir, you are muted.
Yeah. Dr. Rohit, what is the cause of the iron deficiency in the first place?
She had menorrhagia, sir. Severe menorrhagia was there. So it was persistent. She was on OCP usage previously.
Okay. Menorrhagia of any determined etiology or undetermined etiology?
No, sir. In her case, we could not evaluate the cause, sir. We have done the ultrasound. We have taken the gynae consultations. But uterus and ovaries were of normal morphology only in the ultrasound. And only polycystic ovaries were there. That's all.
And peripheral smear was normal. There were no
peripheral
sickle
smear.
cells.
It was suggestive iron deficiency anemia, sir. It was of microcytic and hyperchronic anemia.
Did you check for thalassemia or sickle cells?
No, sir. In her case, we have not checked for the thalassemia or sickle cells.
Okay.
Now that she has improved also, moreover with the iron corrections and blood transfusions and follow-up also, she was doing well. So we thought we didn't evaluate for it.
And where was she from?
She's from Bangalore only, sir.
What she hailed from originally from Bangalore, or she came from different place and settled here?
No, sir. As we know, she stays in the electronics city, somewhere near around.
There are certain tribes who are prone to the sickle cells in India. Did she have any history like that?
No, sir. Not sir.
She is from Bangalore, Kerpuram, that area only, sir. So she is properly of Bangalore. This one, she is not. Here she had clear-cut iron deficiency because of menorrhagia, and iron levels are low. MCV was low. So the problem here, what we were facing was this young lady. She had. She used to come to this. If the story of really 1.5 years now, almost reaching 2 years. Last follow-up was last month. She's doing okay now. So
Yeah.
the issue was that she had different types of headache, and then decision making in the OPD, when to image, when not to image, how to manage. And then this COVID also came, and I think how many RT-PCR we have done, we don't know. I think 3 times we have done RAT, then RT-PCR, because fever, UTI, she used to become better. Once again, is it a COVID type of disease? This is the peak of May, June, we saw her, I think next time, last year.
Yeah. Was she continuously on anticoagulants?
Sir, actually till December we did, it's a provoked CVT because of anemia and OCP induced. So in November I had stopped the warfarin, and then after 4 weeks I evaluated for all procoagulant workup. Everything came negative, and so we stopped the warfarin. And then she was only on anti-epileptic because she had a scar in her brain till Feb. And after February she disappeared. Only she landed up back with headache and seizures in during the beginning of the corona. So
Do you think there was an opportunity to do LP earlier?
Oh, sir, it was a provoked CVT in the beginning, and then she was all right. Then she came back with fever, headache, seizure, and she had UTI picture, which is actually telling us fever could be the cause of it, and then seizures, another new onset, new CVT had developed on the right frontal. So we could attribute that headache as well as UTI could be causing on that. And then we have treated that time because we had to restarted on our anticoagulation. She was finding difficulty to take warfarin. So this time APLA was also negative. We started her on NOACs this time because it was a mild this one. And she improved after UTI treatment. She improved. And then once again, 4 weeks later, she came back with worsening, means intermittent headaches used to be there. As he was mentioning, she used to tell that she had some mild headache, and she came and asked me, I want to die, can you help me? So because she was fed up because they have to pull up money. She was the daughter and brothers were supporting her and they couldn't go through it. That's the reason we thought headaches are also due to more of stress related. And then fever used to come on and off, and then every time some urine used to show. So this is where we got, so that was the issue. So practical issues were this. So lumbar puncture here also we planned when fever was there, since anticoagulation needs to be stopped and she had CVT, we were a little skeptical of stopping anticoagulation.
Raghu, any interaction of Novax and ATT?
Not much, sir. So not much. That is the ATT was subsequently started and not much of interaction. ATT was started after 3 months after, means we could able to diagnose definitely meningitis. Was meningitis there before? I'm not very sure, but suddenly there was started a hydrocephalus. So only thing was a clue that she vomited. So usually tension type headaches will not have vomiting. Previous evening she told doctor, I want to die, can you help me? And her headaches was worsening in the night, and then she vomited in the morning. At least then he was a resident. He told we'll repeat a scan. And it was surprising that I didn't expect that scan to show hydrocephalus because we had done 5 days back. CT was looking normal. So the practical issues were different types of headaches in a given patients and managing and decision making.
Yeah, very interesting.
So finally, right now she is on maintenance dose of ATT and dabigatran and lacosamide. She is doing well. She had come last 15 days back to the OPD and her headache has totally resolved. Intermittently,
You have not talked of antidepressants, Dr. Nadi.
Amitriptyline she is on, sir.
Yeah. Because death wish, she should certainly see a psychiatrist straight away.
That is all arranged, sir. Psychiatrist also had seen. So then it turned out to be meningitis after that. So empirically we had treated, they had clues of hyponatremia, the counts were not high and she had not received antibiotics, partially treated bacterial versus TBM, but looking at the picture, basal exudates, MON2 being positive and all. So we started ATT and steroids and I think over next 6 weeks, even hydrocephalus results. We were on the verge of putting a shunt and EVD. So because of the constraint, they were not agreeing. So
Dr. Rohit was telling MAN2 became positive. Was it earlier negative?
MON2 was not done, sir. This time we did MON2. MON2 was positive.
What significance in Indian context can you give to MAN2?
Sir, in the overall scenario,
meningitis.
Yes, overall scenario, if MON2 is strongly positive, like more than say 10, 15, then we can attribute that there may be an active inflammation going on.
I think we all have undetected, tuberculosis early in life. We will all be positive.
But it will not be positive, we may get some induration, sir. But in this lady, it was a big induration. And with hyponatremia, subacute meningitis, and basal exudates. So at least one report is there for us to be strong to see that it is a TBM. But that's the only thing.
But in the TBM, MAN2 will not be positive.
So that's true, sir. But sometimes it can be a clue. TBM, the gold standard.
And how big was the reaction?
Reaction, I don't remember, but it was more than 15 mm. If I don't know, I'll have to ask Rohit on the case sheet. But I think it was positive. It was not more than 20 like this one. It was between some 10 or 15 it was there, sir.
I am an old timer. I think MAN2 in India is useless. I don't know what others think about it.
In the clinical scenario, that is the only hinge I had to take and put the ATT. Otherwise, I didn't have much evidence. Only subacute meningitis, and there was hyponatremia, which could happen in any meningitis, and then hydrocephalus, basal exudate in an young lady with under this one. So most of the time, TBM is empirically treated here. To prove it is very difficult. Here, CSF also we couldn't do.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. TBM diagnosis should be clinical always. And there is a practice among some people of doing PCR and CSF, which is totally wrong.
Even
you
if
should not do, and even if you do,
yes,
it is fruitless because See, for TBM, if you have to accept a test, that test should be 99.99% sensitive and specific. Otherwise, even missing one patient out of 10,000 of a treatable disease like tuberculosis will be a very grave mistake. So you should do it clinically only.
Yeah, it is a clinical, more of clinical. If PCR had come negative also, I would have continued the ATT. So that is the clinical
You
lesson.
should
This
not
case
do
was-
PCR in TBM.
So this case was brought to discuss the various issues, primary, secondary, in the OPD basis. We all see these patients. We should have a low threshold to rule out a neuro infection in any patients who has got fever. Until unless you do a lumbar puncture, we may not be able to detect a neuro infection because partially treated, they would have treated. Guru Prasad.
Answering Umashankar's question, dabigatran has some interaction with rifampicin. So basically, rifampicin is a PGP inducer. So I think I was reviewing dabigatran a few weeks back. So I just happened to see that. So we need to be careful when you're using rifampicin with dabigatran, but not as much as the older conventional anticoagulants. And I think I had also same question. Dr. Thomas has asked this question on the chat and Q&A, that whether TBM can explain the CVT. Whether TBM was there earlier and it would cause, I think, very unusual. Bacterial meningitis, we know.
Timeline itself, Guru. The
Yeah, timelines are different.
Different.
No, the first time definitely she didn't have CVT, TBM in last year 2019. So when this fever started during the COVID, so see fever, headache, COVID. So we were thinking all COVID related. So I'm not sure whether we were having, because if you see there were CTs were done. First MRI contrast didn't show any iota of meningitis. We have a contrast MRI at that time.
And that too, TBM with thing is very unusual. Bacterial meningitis you can understand. But TBM is very, very
asked why quantiferon was not done. I think it was a financial thing which we couldn't send any other test, quantiferon gold. And Novax really has to be stopped for 48 hours for doing any procedure. So I think that is one more question. We thought about it. We'll stop and then see, but we didn't want to take a risk in this patient. So we didn't do, and she started clinically improving.
Raghu, here just one more question. When you talk about Novax, stopping Novax for lumbar puncture, there was a discussion a few days ago about stopping antiplatelets for lumbar puncture. Is it indicated to stop or not to stop?
If it is a clopidogrel, it is better to stop for 7 days. If it is aspirin, you can continue it, sir. Clopidogrel, it has been told strictly for 7 days you have to stop. So, but what we are clinically practicing is for half-life of at least 4 days, I'm stopping. If it is an emergency, I have cases like this, coronary artery disease on dual antiplatelets has come with meningitis. So I have stopped clopidogrel for 1 week, and we have done those turned out to be cryptococcal meningitis and also. Aspirin, you can do it. But clopidogrel, it is, see, we have used to do earlier without that knowledge. Once we know that it should not be done, it is difficult. So earlier we have done, I am not saying I have done, but without much of knowledge at that time. But now it says that ideally it has to be stopped for 7 days before attempting a lumbar puncture in clopidogrel. Aspirin, you can do it.
So
in corporates, we all mostly ask anesthetists to do it, and no question of doing on antiplatelets. They straight away refuse.
Aspirin, they will do it, but clopidogrel,
so
no.
When we require heroics to do it, we'll ask our, Dr. Mayank is here, juniors or PGs to do it. Otherwise, anesthetists don't no question.
I think we'll start the next topic. Now. Nataraj sir.
Yeah. We will go on to the next case. The next case is by Dr. Shukumar.
Mayank, sir.
Mayank?
Yeah.
Okay, Mayank Srivastav from Columbia Asia Hospital. He will be presenting interesting case whether to plug or to tolerate. So we will go on to the case by Dr. Mayank Srivastav.
Thank you, sir. Very good evening to all the guests present out here. So I will share my slides now. Am I audible, sir?
Yeah, you are audible.
So this 50-year-old female, she was diagnosed to have IIH in 1990. So about 25 years back. She had been started with tablet Diamox from then onwards. Intermittently, lumbar puncture had been done, and with which she had the relief in the headache. Few years later, she also had developed a CSF leak, but there was no treatment which was offered for the CSF leak, as she was telling that the doctor had told that CSF leak is acting as actually a natural diversion procedure for her. And in between, there were attempts to taper off the Diamox, but once she will stop it for 2 or 3 days, she will start having headache. So thus the Diamox was kept on the minimal dose of 250 milligram OD. So she was taking that medications from last 20-25 years. And from last 2 to 3 months, she came to us with a complaint of heaviness of the head, along with the imbalance while walking. So when she came to us, she just wanted the solution for the heaviness of head, and she didn't want any solution for her CSF rhinorrhea or IH per se. So clinical examination was normal, ophthalmic evaluation we had done. So it didn't show any papilledema or any defect on the visual acuity. So we did the MRI. So MRI was showing, you can see the CSF intensity fluid in the right ethmoid cells, and the dependent CSF intensity in the right sphenoid sinus. So there was a bony defect in the claviform plate on the right, where the left was normal. And there was increase in the perioptic CSF space of both the optic nerves. And there was loss of normal convex contour of the upper margin of pituitary, which was flattened out. So these all MRI features were present inside her. And there was also asymmetrically prominent right Meckel's cave. You can see here. So that the question which came to us, what should be the further line of management? So this is a poll question. Is it done? Answer is not coming on my screen. I'm not able to see the answers. Yeah. So correct. That what we thought of. So most of us just wanted the same approach, that Diamox should be tapered off, and then it stopped after repairing of the CSF leak. So now gradually, one by one, we are going to see about the history of CSF along with the IEH. So CSF leaks, they had been traditionally classified as the traumatic and the non-traumatic. Non-traumatic CSF leak, they may be spontaneous in the absence of a cause like the skull base abnormalities or bone erosion that may be related to tumor or hydrocephalus. Sometimes when it is related with the increased ICP, then it is also called as high pressure CSF leaks. So generally, what we see, the IH patient and CSF leak very routinely, and it has been diagnosed and managed by the neuro-ophthalmologist very often, but there are very few studies which had seen the association of the CSF leaks in the IH patients or co-occurrence of these two entities altogether. And there are very few literatures also. So the studies done by, the large studies done by Clark D and the Schlossler RJ, so they told it as a rare phenomena or underestimated also. Reason we are going to discuss in the next few slides. So when it comes to a CSF leak with the IH, generally the symptoms, they vary greatly depending on the multiple factors, like what is the location of the leak. Suppose if it is the posterior fossa, patient will be presenting with the otorrhea or the conductive hypoacusia. Where if the patient is having anterior fossa of the defects, they will be presenting as the CSF rhinorrhea, like in the defects of the cribriform plate, with our patient also presented. Sometimes the initial presentation of the CSF leak may be the bacterial meningitis. Now, the study done by the Clark D, that found that some patient may also have the symptoms of increased ICP even when the leak is active. But most often they will be developing the symptoms whenever we will try to repair this CSF leaks. So after a few months, they had seen that once the CSF leak was repaired, patient was symptom free, and then after a few months, started having the intense headache with a characteristic of the IAH. So coming back to our answer, like we should repair the CSF leak or not. So although the spontaneous resolution are seen after the treatment of increased ICP, but there are obvious risk of the bacterial meningitis in the case of chronic CSF leaks, which usually requires the additional endoscopic surgical repair. Now, coming to the association of the CSF leak with the IAH, these entities altogether, if you will see, they have the overlap. There is a striking overlap between the demographic, clinical, and the radiological characteristics. Like if we just exclude the age, so in both of these patients, like the CSF leak and the IAH, patients are generally female, obese, and age-wise, if we see the CSF leaks with IAH, generally they will go to the 50s or 60s, whereas the young female will present more in the case of the IAH. This is because, again, the CSF leak will be acting as a diversion procedure. So this is one of the reports in the English literature where they have found out the patients with CSF leak and the IAH. So we can see clearly that most of the patients who are having the symptoms of CSF leak, like rhinorrhea, headaches, orthostatic headaches, most of these females were either moderately obese, or they have the high BMI. Along with that, the CSF pressure, when they had seen, most of them have the elevated CSF pressure or marginally elevated CSF pressure. So when it's coming to diagnosing IH in the patients with the CSF leak, so if as a whole isolated IH we would see, there are very classical findings which we can see in the optic nerves, like the prominent subarachnoid space, vertical tortuosity of the optic nerves, papilledema, the flattening of the posterior sclera, intraocular protrusion of the optic nerve head. When it comes to enlarged arachnoid outpouchings, we may see the partial empty sella turcica and large Meckel cave, prominent arachnoid pits, small meningoceles that will typically present the temporal bone and the sphenoid vein. And sometimes we may also see the bilateral venous sinus stenosis, most common the transverse cyanosis. But when it comes to CSF leak with the IAH, what happened because of the diversion, generally the partial or the complete empty sella, which is a very prominent finding in the IAH patients, that may be present in about 80% of the patients. Compared to those people, the prevalence of the part of complete empty sella in the patient having CSF leak with IAH will be about 60%. But still, it will be the most prominent and the most important radiological finding. Now, the optic nerve tortuosity, dilatation of the perioptic space, and the flattened posterior sclera had of about 10-15% respectively, compared to, you can see, about 45%, 60%, and 65% when it's seen in the patient with the classical IAH. So obviously, these findings, they just come down the prevalence-wise when it comes to the co-occurrence of these two entities. So now, what is the significance of empty sella and the CSF fluid leaks? So this is the study done by the Rodney J. et al. And they had found that in 16 patients with the spontaneous CSF leaks and 12 patients with the non-spontaneous CSF leak, they had surgically treated, and they had followed the patient from 96 to 2002. What they found out in the patient who had the spontaneous CSF leak, in those patients, 100% had the partial or the complete empty cell. Whereas in the non-spontaneous group, the prevalence was very low. It is about 11%. So again, these patients, this cohort of patients become very important. The reason being, first thing, obviously, the demographics, they were more common in the obese male, and along with that, require actually more aggressive surgical and the medical treatment, so as to prevent the recurrence of the multiple leaks. So after repairing, how they behave, again, the way the patients with the CSF leak along with the IH behaves is different from what a patient who is having isolated CSF leak. Like this is the study done by Mohammed et al. So about 46 patients, they had seen after treating for the CSF leaks, about 21 patients, they presented with the recurrence of CSF leaks following the procedure. So as a whole, we can say that in the absence of control of ICP, the recurrence of CSF leak after the repair is about 25 to 87%. But as you can see, once the appropriate control of the ICP is taken over, the rate of success becomes, it closely resembles the rate of success of the surgical repair of CSF leak of other etiologies, that is about 95%. So some authors generally believe that the interventions to lower the ICP, they should either be done at the time of the surgical repair, or if we can start, we should start it before the surgical repair of the CSF leaks. So now coming to the diagnosis in those patients who are having CSF leaks with IH. So these are the classical clinical findings of the headache that will present most frequently in the patients with IH, then the visual obscuration, pulsatile tinnitus, and the back pain. Now coming to the diagnostic criteria, so there are two variants, like this is the modified Dundee criteria, in which the papilledema is must. Along with that, patient should have the normal neurological examination. Neuroimaging should be normal, that is the brain parenchyma. There must not be any hydrocephalus, structural lesion, venous thrombosis. CSF constituents must be normal, and lumbar puncture pressure should be elevated. That is the limit what they have given was 25, more than 25 mmHg. Now, when it comes to the IH without papilledema, the diagnostic criteria changes a little bit. That is, the patient should have the normal neurological examination, neuroimaging should be normal, CSF constituents should be normal, lumbar puncture pressure should be elevated, but along with that, there should be the clinical signs of unilateral or bilateral 6th cranial nerve palsy. Then it comes to the definite IH without papilledema. But when it comes to possible, these criteria should be present like C, D, and E. Along with that, 3 of the neuroimaging findings should be there. That is empty-sella, flattening of the posterior aspect of the globe, distension of the perioptic subarachnoid space, plus minus optic nerve, and the transverse venous sinus stenosis. So this is how, if a patient with IH without papilledema comes, we have to put these diagnostic criteria so as to diagnose properly if the patient's having headache, and we must exclude the other entities also. So this is the Frison's grading of papilledema. So one is, there is a minimal degree of the edema, and there is a temporal disc margin will be normal, wherein the second grade of edema, there will be circumferential halo, but there won't be any major vessel obscuration. Coming to the third grade, there will be circumferential halo and elevation of all the borders, and there will be the vessel obscuration will be started from here. Now, fourth is the marked degree of edema. There will be total obscuration on the disc of segment of major blood vessels on the disc, and there will be elevation of whole of the nerve head, and there will be complete obscuration. And coming to the grade 5, which is the most severe grade of the edema, there will be obscuration of all vessels on the disc and leaving the disc also. So once you are diagnosing the patient with the IH along with the papilledema, there are the various types of treatment which you can offer based on the whether visual deterioration is there or not there. When visual deterioration is not there, you can right away start with the treatment for lowering down the CSF pressure. The most prominent drugs which most of the people use are the carbonic anhydrase inhibitors. So in about 165 patients, this was one of the biggest study which was done in about 165 patients. And what they had found out after starting the carbonic anhydrase inhibitors, that is the acetazolamide, there was the improvement, there was modest improvement in the perimetric measurement of the global visual field loss, along with the improvements in the papilledema grade. And with that, CSF pressure also decreased. And the quality of the life that was much more improved after when they followed most of the patients after 6 months. So in one study, they told that the long-term follow-up study was there, and they had found that for about 14 months, the treatment should be followed upon, it should be given upon. So the general dose to start with is 500 milligram twice per day, and we can go up to 4 grams per day as tolerated by the patients. Generally, with high doses, people started having the side effects related to the acetazolamide. So, but most of the people, they will be tolerating this 2 gram per day sort of doses. Now, in some case report and one small unblinded study, they had found that topiramate also can be one of the substituent for the acetazolamide, and it appears to have the similar efficacy as the acetazolamide with regard to the visual field improvement and the symptom relief. And along with the improvement in the symptoms of the vision, these treatments also offer help in reducing the weight loss, reducing the weight. So that is again one of the major things which we should take into consideration while treating the patient of the IH with the CSF leak or IH per se. Now coming to the glucocorticoids, so generally we should never recommend it for a long-term treatment. Obviously, if we want to delay the surgery in the setting of the acute visual loss, a short course of intravenous glucocorticoid may be useful as a temporary measure only. So one case series that described methylprednisolone about 250 milligram 4 times a day for 5 days, followed by an oral triplet. Along with that, they had started with the acetazolamide. But it should never be given for the long-term treatment. Now, there are a few studies which recommended indomethacin also, but obviously a lot more studies has to be done for that. Now, coming to the patients who fail, intolerant, or they are non-compliant with the maximum medical therapy and continues to have the intractable headache or the progressive visual loss, they generally appear to benefit for the surgical intervention. So the indication or the potential indication for the surgical therapy will be including the worsening visual field defect despite the medical therapy, presence of visual acuity loss attributed to papilledema, intractable headache, and the anticipated hypotension, like in the patient who are having blood pressure treatment or the renal dialysis. So in these patients, theoretically, there may be the precipitation of the ischemic optic neuropathy. So now, if we are offering the treatment surgically, then there are various options. Like one of the option is the optic nerve sheath fenestration. So generally, it will prominently help in the stabilizing or improving the visual loss due to papilledema and IEH. So compared to the headache, there are more extensive documentation of the benefit on the visual functions. Generally, preservation of the vision when it is your primary goal, we can obviously opt for the optic nerve sheath fenestration, because many patients, they will be continuous to experience headache. So in that way, if another procedure or another surgical treatment we consider, that will be CSF shunting procedure, which may include the ventriculoperitoneal shunts or the lumboperitoneal shunts. So obviously, because of the inconvenience to the patients, generally it is not the first treatment which we offer to the patients, but obviously they will have a good result when it comes to the in the relief of headache, diplopia, papilledema, and the visual loss in patients with the IH. Complication may arise because of this, and they can be like infection, abdominal pain, back pain, radicular pain, operative complication, and CSF leak with the low pressure. So not very recently, but one of the new treatment which has been come into fore is the venous sinus stenting. So little bit controversial because generally it is based on the gradient across the stenosis. So till now it is not very clear that the apparent stenosis of the transverse venous sinus, it is because of the disease altogether or it is a secondary phenomenon. But still, the centers who are well equipped with these procedures, they are still doing it, and patients will be getting benefit in the headache. So this is the flow chart. So suppose a patient comes to us with the intractable headache, and visual changes are there, but there are no focal neurological deficits fitting into the Randy criteria. We have done the MRI, MRB, and obviously we have found out the patient is having IEH, no papilledema. We can opt for the lumbar puncture. If opening pressure is high, straight away we can go to the medical management. If headache is with the papilledema, lumbar puncture is not, either we are not doing or is not mandatory, then we can go for the medical management directly straight away. But suppose the lumbar puncture is, we have done and the CSF pressure is below the normal range, that is the 25, then we have to evaluate the other causes also. Now, suppose it comes to that the medical management is unsuccessful. Already we have discussed that either we can go with the CSF flow diversion procedures or the optic nerve sheath fenestration. We have to see which is the primary complaint, whether it is visual or whether it is the headache. And then we have obviously have to go for the long-term follow-up. Now, suppose in a patient in which we have already put the shunt and they have the exacerbation of the headache, then what should we think about? So first of all, the prominent thing we should see whether any clinical signs of CNS infection is there or not. If they are present, then obviously we should go for the lumbar puncture or shunt tap, and we should do whatever we do for the meningitis per se. But suppose there are no clinical signs of the CNS infection, then we obviously should see for the papilledema. And if there is a papilledema and the visual deterioration, obviously we should consider for the shunt revision. Papilledema is there, but visual functions are stable. Then again, it comes to, we should always evaluate what kind of headache the person is having, because along with that IH headache, patient may also having the tension type of headache or the medication overuse headache or the migraine per se also may present. So it is very important to differentiate the kind of headache patient is having. Suppose there is no papilledema, and then obviously we should ask for whether the type of headache has change in nature, like it is whether it is a low pressure headache or not. If it is, again we have to see for the we have to see for the pressure management. We have to see whether any leak is there or not. If not there, then obviously again we have to evaluate the type of headache which the patient is having. So coming to the conclusion, CSF leak may be secondary to IH, symptoms of which may not be apparent until leak is repaired. So IH management should be started simultaneously or before the surgical repair of CSF leak in those cohorts of patients, as the risk of recurrence of the CSF leak is very high. We have to follow the patient's time-wise regular ophthalmic evaluation is needed so as to guide the therapy for the IH. And again, if the patient is having recurrence of headache with the therapies or with the shunts, proper history and characterization of headache is utmost importance for the patient to continues to have headache in spite of medical and the surgical management. Thank you. So we can't hear you.
You have to unmute, sir.
Yeah, that was a very interesting presentation on coexistence of CNS, spontaneous leaks with IAH. I would like to ask a question. Has weight reduction per se or bariatry been used as a primary treatment for IAH in your review of literature? Mayank.
Yeah, sir. They have actually compared the weight reduction along with that weight reduction plus acetazolamide. So what they found out, obviously the chances of improvement and the symptomatic improvement was much more in the patients who are taking acetazolamide along with the weight reduction. So obviously weight reduction is the one thing we should always tell, but along with that we should start with the treatment per se also.
Going for bariatry, maybe hitting two birds in one stone. Okay, that may be a better option. What do you say?
Depending on the weights.
Yeah, of course, depending on the weight. We are not able to hear you, Mayank.
I will take this one. So as Mayank had presented, basically the evidence for use of topiramate, it's still not there. So most of the centers, most of the evidence is for acetazolamide, even though topiramate is very similar to thing. And also the dosage is not very clear how much dose we can go up. So I would rather go with other means to weight reduction in weight along with acetazolamide rather than topiramate.
Wouldn't it complicate the issue?
Coming back to the case, just a little brief of this, because a few months back, one of ENT surgeon, not from our hospital, outside, had mentioned that when he did couple of corrections, says of rhinorrhea corrections, he said that there was a increase in pressure. He in fact told me that to read up and let me know how was it. So I in fact, because we have a series of more than 25 patients in our hospital in the last 10 to 15 years, we have not seen this type of situation. So I in fact must say honestly admit I ignored it. I read a little bit of articles and I thought probably it is not possible. But looking at this patient, I was really taken aback. And she was happily having rhinorrhea. In fact, in front of me in the OPD, she had a few drops and she said, it's helping me. So why should I bother about the CS of rhinorrhea? So then, we went through the literature and all. So not very common, but it's more and more people are seeing this. But question is, how do you tackle this type of dual issues? So that's the reason why you presented this case.
I remember an interesting patient who had put on some weight and presented with IAH, and I asked her why you have put on weight. She said, I feel like eating more, I am a bit depressed and all that. So I counseled her and gave her antidepressants and asked her to reduce weight. She did not come back. Okay, I don't know what happened. So the weight reduction, I believe in weight reduction as one of the first steps we can take. Yeah.
Also,
Any
sir,
other-
yeah, Dr. Sriram here, sir. There is another thing. We look for CSF leaks mainly for rhinorrhea, otorrhea, but there could be meningococcyles in the spine as well, and there could be spinal leaks, which I don't think so. There are any studies which have evaluated for the spontaneous spinal leaks in IIH patients. So that could be a contributory factor, which improvement after a long term of history of IIH, sir, because they don't present with symptoms of hypotension most of the time, and probably there will be a balance of pressure and clinical improvement. But otorrhea and rhinorrhea, they definitely have symptoms, so they present more often as compared to spinal leaks.
Yeah, they can form a spinal kind of meningocele, and they can give rise to radiculopathy. And maybe when tension reaches a particular level, it will break open also and give rise to spontaneous leaks.
Sriram, I just wanted to ask you, so because a lot of times we send MRIs, we know they are not, there's no disc edema, they're behaving like primary headaches, but sometimes MRI reports comes as there are features of, IH.
Yes.
There's some toxicity of the optic nerves, there's some increased perioptic spaces. So what's the sensitivity and specificity of, MRI findings vis-a-vis the IH? How much
Yes, sir,
can it, it's in the criteria now, but how much is it? Thing?
Empty cell is most oftenly described finding in IIH, and the sensitivity range from 80 to 90%. And it can be, again, in middle-aged women, we don't see like a partial or a empty cell ideally because of the hormone status itself. So if we are seeing in a middle-aged female with headache and having a partial empty cell, that's quite sensitive and specific. And apart from that, we routinely see the optic nerve tortuosity, particularly on sagittal sequences. If you see a vertical tortuosity, they say, of the optic nerves is also a good sign, and the sensitivity would be around 70 to 80%. The best marker recently in AJN, or American Journal of Neuroradiology, in last year they have published the transverse sinus stenosis, the transverse sigmoid junction stenosis per se, is a very sensitive marker, and from that study the sensitivity is as high as 97%. Apart from that, the perioptic sheath widening, the flattening of the posterior sclera, intraocular bulge. Sometimes we see diffusion restriction of that papillary optic nerve head, which is bulging, and also sometimes enhancement if you give contrast. So routinely, if there is a clinical suspicion or an unexplained headache, we are having partial empty cell in a middle-aged women with history, we definitely do a MRV also. So MRV, I think, should be routinely done, if there is a transverse sinus stenosis, it definitely adds sensitivity in telling that it could be idiopathic IIH.
To add
with the permission of the chair, there's two questions. There's a question by Dr. K. R. Butch asking, can we do a thecopeptide shunt for IH and the CSF leak could stop by itself? But I think answering that question, the shunt surgery for IH should be on the merit of IH. For example, if you have tried, medical treatment and it has failed, and the patient is symptomatic in terms of headaches, refractory headaches, and with papilledema, then I think you consider. You can wait for some time for the spontaneous CSF leak to correct, but if it is not, I think it has to be corrected as well, especially if there is a bony defect. If it is a very mild CSF leak, we probably can wait. But if it is a bony defect, you have demonstrated that, I think you should go for a correction. And the other question is chronic CVT with IH and venous collaterals. What is the line of management? Want to take it, Raghu? Chronic CVT with IH and venous collaterals. What is the line of management? So I think IH with CVT, chronic CVT, I don't think that the treatment should change.
See, usually chronic CVTs, collaterals will come up actually, and sometimes in a CVT it is not that even they develop AV malformations down the line. So here I think there is a practical problem, as it was telling that they are putting shunts if it is a transverse sinus. See, there is transverse sinus stenosis could be a cause or effect of a CVT. So basically what has been noticed if it is at the junction where it turns, like a transverse sinus becomes sigmoid, if there is a stenosis, it is probably due to the raised ICT, CVT, raised ICP that is causing the stenosis. If you see a stenosis at the middle of the vein, then you can attribute that is a venous stenosis which could lead to CVT. There, the shunting may help. Rather than at the junction, if it is stenosis, it could be an effect of raised ICT. So that is what is the practical thing. And another thing, as Guru was telling, people come with headache and the radiologist report will be like IAH, and then if you do no papilledema, patients will not be willing lumbar puncture. This is where topiramate is going to help us. So we have practically started topiramate on these patients and followed up. And so if there is a migraine, tension, headache, even IH, all will respond to topiramate, and we can closely follow up and definitely advise a weight loss and follow up this patient's fundal examination. So that is what. And most important thing in the IH is the losing the eye. So we have patients who have been not taken care of it and they have come with blind. That is when the thecoperitoneal shunt will help, or the optic nerve fenestration. So we have to be like a OCD. We have to follow up this patient, frequent fundal examination to look at the papilledema and perimetry assessment, because otherwise they may lose the eye. So that is why this benign name was taken off, and it is no longer called as a benign intracranial hypertension. So that is the most important thing, is following up these patients.
One more thing I wanted to know, the house thing. How many years do you think? Because this lady, our patient, has been on Diamox for 30 years. So usually, what is the trend you do? How many years you give and then you taper off and then follow it up? So I just wanted to know the concerns of my colleagues.
It's basically what we are following up these IH patients. Once their papilledema is resolved, see the optic nerve diameter they will be following up. If it comes below 3.5, means normally a 3.5 to 4, that is when we start tapering the diameter. See, other thing as weight reduction is the most important thing, and look at the other secondary factors. So then you start tapering once the papilledema is not there. So that is when we can taper and stop and follow up. Don't forget, we have patients who have been stopped, disappeared, and they have come back with once again with a raised ICT. So the most important thing in these patients are they needs to be under followed up, and they have to be told, need not be taken for 30 years and all. So we have stopped, we'll be able to stop within 6 months to 1 year, basically based on the optic nerve sheath diameter.
Yeah. So we are going through literature. They said around 40%, 40 to 45% of recurrence after withdrawing in the acetazolamide. So I think the important is to follow them up regularly, every 3 months, 6 months. Look at their fundus.
Yeah, I think we have time is less now. I think we'll go for the next topic.
I think the next speaker will be Dr. Shiv Kumar, Senior Consultant Neurologist from Sakra Hospital. He will be presenting on headaches presenting as stroke. Dr. Shiv Kumar, you can go ahead.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the kind introduction. And I'll be taking through this small case, which has got some learning points for us in our clinical practice. So this was a lady who was 30 years old male. I hope I am audible to everyone.
Yeah, loud and clear.
Yeah.
Okay. This is a lady who was 30 years old female who had presented to the emergency department with history of slurring of speech. And then she had had some weakness in the right hand. And then gradually the weakness increased to involve the whole upper limb and then the lower limb. And it was of almost like a 6 hours duration. And after she started having this weakness in the hand and the leg, then she started having headache and little bit of nausea. So when we asked about the history of headache, it almost developed like about 2 to 3 hours after the onset of weakness. And she had some kind of a severe pulsatile pounding headache with only nausea. There was no any vomiting, and there was no any loss of consciousness. She never had any seizures. So when we asked a little bit about the past history, she was out of the window period. If at all we were considering stroke, it was about 6 hours. So we took little more time to find out what is happening to her in the past. And she was treated for seizures in the childhood with anticonvulsants, but she never complained of any weakness or any kind of focal deficits whenever she had seizures. And she became seizure free and her medications were stopped at the age of 10 years. When we examined her in the ER, she was absolutely normal, conscious. Her vitals was completely normal. She had mild dysarthria, and she was telling us that she is almost recovered by more than 80%. That is, from the weakness point of view, her hand and the leg weakness had improved by more than 80% by the time she has come to the OPD. So this was a presenting complaint in the ER. So I would like to put up the first poll question. Someone can start the poll. I think there's some problem. We are not getting the poll results. So we all know that when someone, yeah. So almost I can say that the first three and the last one, more or less, it's equally divided. So what it says is that anyone who comes with such kind of a focal neurological deficits with headache and then gradually improving, definitely I think we will consider a neurovascular syndrome, either an ischemic or a hemorrhagic stroke. More in case of hemorrhagic stroke because of the headache and vomiting. She had history of seizures in the childhood. So definitely one has to consider focal seizures, whether it is a rare possibility of a post-ictal palsy happening in this lady who had presented to the emergency. And of course, we have to always consider secondary headache whenever there is any kind of a focal neurological deficits happening. So the right answer here would be that we have to consider all the possibilities in view of the seizures in the childhood. So we did a CT brain with a CT angiogram in the emergency, which was completely normal. So our possibility of ischemic and hemorrhagic stroke, a large at least ischemic stroke, was ruled out. And there was no any vascular malformations like aneurysms or AVMs, which was seen on the CT angiogram. So the first possibility was ruled out based on the CT, because 6 hours post-ictus, CT should pick up at least some changes if at all there is an infarct in that, which was not seen. So whether it could be a focal seizure with thought paralysis, yes, of course, we have to consider this possibility when someone has a history of seizures in the past. The problem here was there was headache which was on the left side, which could not be explained with a CT showing that it is normal. Could be sometimes post-ictal headache, which is a possibility which we consider, which can be considered. Symptoms fully reversible within few hours, that is about 6 hours, which is little odd, but still possible. Neuroimaging can be normal or abnormal in focal seizures with Todd's palsy. And often whenever we see someone having Todd paralysis with focal seizure, they usually give history of loss of consciousness and they'll have a little bit of post-ictal confusion, which was not seen in this case. So the only point which was favoring us was there was some history of seizures in the childhood and she had good response to medications, and the medications were stopped after she had a remission for more than 5 years. So the only important history what we see here is that the evolution of the symptoms was very slow. It started with a little bit of speech problem, then there was weakness of the hand, and then slowly the weakness of the upper limb, and then the lower limb happened, followed by headache. So this kind of slow evolution of symptom does not favor the possibility of a seizure presenting as Todd's palsy. This was a strong point for us to say that probably this is not the case, but still this was kept as a possibility in this lady who presented to the emergency. So the next investigation, what we considered was we did an MRI brain with venogram to rule out if there is any kind of infarct which was missed on the CT scan. It was completely normal. And we all know that sometimes MRI can be normal in the initial stages of stroke, particularly if it is a posterior circulation stroke. But the possibility was looking less likely in view of slow evolution of the symptoms. And we did an EEG to rule out if there is any IEDs or focal slowing or non-convulsive status, which was also not seen. So all the investigations which were done in the first few hours after she presented to us was completely normal. So then we admitted her and we investigated her with a lumbar puncture to find out what was the reason for her headache and her focal neurological deficits, which had improved by the time she got admitted. The CSF was completely normal. There was no OCBs. And only one thing which I would like to highlight here is if someone has got a headache, focal neurological deficit, there is an entity called as Handle, which can present with focal neurological deficits getting reversed. But usually it takes a long time, about 3 months for them to have resolution of the symptoms. And other investigations will be completely normal in this entity. That's only a highlight to tell us that if CSF protein is elevated without any other investigation, one has to consider this possibility in the emergency. I have not seen any case. It's only a theoretical discussion here. And then what happened during the course of illness is that her headache completely resolved and the deficits also recovered within 24 hours. And the whatever workup we could do in her was completely normal. So we could not find any reason. So based on the symptom, our neurologist considered probably it could be a kind of a RIND-like manifestation. They treated her with antiplatelets with aspirin 150. They did a limited investigation for finding out if it was stroke in young, and all the investigations was completely normal. And she was kept under regular follow-up on a monthly basis. And whenever she used to come for follow-up, she used to complain of occasional hemicranial headaches with some kind of a subtle tingling sensation on the right side of the body, which used to subside within few hours, like maybe around 3 to 4 hours. She never required any painkillers or NSAIDs for controlling her headache, and she was completely normal. And these headaches were passed as saying they were not disabling and no medicines were started. Occasionally, she used to use painkillers like Hyphenac and paracetamol. So based on these symptoms, the clinician in the OPD thought probably it could be some kind of an atypical migraine with some aura. She had a lot of stressors. She was an IT professional and probably thought she could have some kind of a somatoform disorder associated with this vascular headache, and she was kept. She never fulfilled the criteria of migraine like photophobia, phonophobia, no nausea, vomiting. There was no alternating headaches also happening in her at that point of time. So clinically, we could not say that it was fitting into a case of migraine at that point of time. So a query was always kept in a diagnosis. So what happened 3 months later? This was the father of the girl who had come to us. She called me and told that my father is not speaking properly. And he was around 65 years old. If someone can hear how he's talking, you can just listen. Daughter is trying to question. The questions was based on an interaction with me, what happened on the phone. I tried to ask her what is happening. So she is asking the father to talk few words. He is not able to talk, but he is making sign language and able to appropriately respond by a sign language. He had weakness on the right side. He was not able to move the hand. And the relative of this patient is a doctor, a cardiology resident. So they're trying to check if it is a high blood pressure, stroke, all those kind of things. So his symptoms, they investigated him in a far off place from Bangalore. All the investigations for stroke was normal. He never had any vascular risk factors. He never had any medical comorbidities. All his symptoms again improved within 24 hours and he was absolutely normal. So this was him at 3 months. Then again, there was no other history of headache or any kind of migraine-like symptoms. 6 months later, this was the brother of the patient who is staying in US. They did a WhatsApp call from US saying that my brother also is not talking and he is not able to use the right hand. You can hear he is talking to me. He is able to speak to us only in single monosyllable like words. He hardly can respond to us. And he says that he has headache on the left side. I will just translate whatever he is saying. He is saying in Tamil and a little bit of English. He has headache on the left side. He is not able to talk. He can only talk few words as a monosyllables and he feels weakness in the right hand. So all this happened in the couple of months after this lady presented to us. Again, he never had any medical problems. He never had any history of headaches in the past. So all this happened in these three relatives in the same family. All had speech problems, all had weakness on the right side, all had headache on the left side, all recovered within 24 hours. And only that lady who presented to us in the first episode had some kind of a non-specific headaches with the right hemisensory symptoms. All used to recover within 24 hours. So this was the presentation. And so to summarize, all symptoms recovered within 24 hours. Only the lady continued to have some kind of headache with right hemisensory symptoms with little bit of nausea, but no vomiting, no photophobia or phonophobia. And her significant history was only seizures in childhood, which she responded to anticonvulsants, and she never had any weakness with that. And all the first degree relatives, that is the father and the brother, had this kind of similar symptoms in the last 6 months. The lady was around 30 years old, brother was 35 years old, the father was 65 years old. That means manifesting first at the age of 65 years. And on neurological examination, when the lady and the brother was seen by the doctor, it was completely normal. So what this case emphasizes, why this case is being presented here is, in this case, one has to consider whenever they see an individual like this with this kind of symptoms, we have to entertain a diagnosis of multiple possibilities to rule out that stroke mimics has to be ruled out in this case who present with this kind of symptoms. So the second poll question. So based on the family history, based on the clinical symptoms, the imaging findings and examination, what would one like to rule out here? Whether all these possibilities to be considered or we need not consider this? Please start the poll question. I'll move on for the want of time. Yeah, so 50% say it could be hemiplegic migraine, and still the poll is divided between MELAS, migraine without aura, and Handel. So migraine without aura is not the right answer here, because usually hemiplegia or focal neurological deficits or hemisensory symptoms are usually seen in migraine with aura. It is not seen with migraine without aura. So all other three possibilities could be possible on a theoretical basis. We have to consider all these things whenever we see such kind of cases presenting to us. So migraine with typical aura is completely different from hemiplegic migraine. This has to be understood by us. And the typical features of migraine are not usually present in hemiplegic migraine. That's the second important point. They may have auras. Most of them will have visual auras, but very few can have speech, that is aphasia as an aura. They can have sensory auras, they can have motor auras, but usually hemiplegia will not be seen. They can have very non-specific symptoms like inability to grasp or lift objects, or some kind of a loss of strength or dropping objects. But complete hemiplegia or hemiparesis is not usually seen in migraine with typical auras. So migraine with typical auras is totally different from hemiplegic migraine. And the most important differentiating feature from stroke is the evolution of symptom, which is usually slow in migraine, whereas it is seconds to minute in case of stroke or TIA. The second thing, MELAS, you know that for any differentials in neurology, we always consider mitochondrial disease, which can explain all of the symptoms which are present in a patient, like headache, muscle weakness, seizures, confusion, fatigue. All these things can be explained. So this is some kind of a big basket where we always try to fit whether it could be mitochondrial disease or not. So this can also present like stroke-like episodes, headache, and seizures is a possibility in MELAS. So this was also can be considered in a patient who is presenting like this. And the last, which everyone answered rightly, was hemiplegic migraine, which is a possibility in our case. The genetic background is the most important thing. If you have any family member who is having similar kind of symptoms with speech problems or hemiplegia and headache, we can conclude that this is a case of familial hemiplegic migraine without even testing for genetics. So when the first degree relatives are involved, we can clearly say it is a case of hemiplegic migraine. The only differentiating feature between migraine with aura and hemiplegic migraine is they are not sensitive to migraine provoking agents like nitroglycerin and CGRP. CGRP is coming up in a big way for treatment of migraine. So CGRP is not the one provocative factor in hemiplegic migraine. The dynamics is, the genetics is completely different from migraine with typical aura. And usually in CVA, we see more of negative symptoms, but whereas in migraine or hemiplegic migraine, we see more of positive symptoms, which is again a differentiating feature between stroke and hemiplegic migraine. The next important thing is the attack frequency is very less. They have very few attacks when compared to migraine, which can happen 3 to 4 times in a month. And we can have familial migraine, hemiplegic migraine, and we can also have sporadic hemiplegic migraine. So on the want of time, I'll just move on. Hemiplegic migraine, we'll just cancel this. Hemiplegic migraine can have similar prevalence between sporadic and familial cases. The age of onset of cases is usually 17 years, but we had a case here which had the onset at the age of 65 years, which was odd in our case. That is the father of the patient. Second thing is they'll have very less frequent attacks. For example, they may have only 1, 2, or maximum 3 attacks. On an average, they'll have only 3 attacks in a year. So they'll have very few attacks. That is one of the differentiating features between migraine, typical migraine, and hemiplegic migraine. And they usually have autosomal dominant pattern. And based on imaging, we can also differentiate this familial hemiplegic migraine from other attacks. They usually have a little bit of cerebellar atrophy. They may have a little bit of nystagmus, like gaze-evoked nystagmus in between whenever we examine. Otherwise, most of the neurological examination is completely normal. If by chance during the time of hemiplegia, if you do an MRI and a contrast, you can see some kind of a hypo to hyperperfusion in the area where the cortical depression is seen in these cases. That is documented in very few cases, but normally we say MRI is completely normal in these cases. So we had another gentleman where He came to us with hemiplegia and headache. We thrombolized, assuming that it is a case of ischemic stroke. But later on, when we saw him in the morning in the rounds, he could clearly say that there was kind of a flickering, kind of a zigzag aura which was seen before the attack. And he had this kind of visual auras before also, but he never had hemiplegia. So we had in fact thrombolized because the CT scan was completely normal. And this lady was diagnosed as psychogenic hemiparesis. Whenever she comes with history of headache and hemiparesis, always the hemiparesis used to be on the left side, and which was the differentiating feature between psychogenic and again hemiplegic migraine. So these cases were sporadic. There was no any family history available in these two cases. So I'll just move on. I'll not go to the questions here. Usually there are 3 genes which have been identified for familial hemiplegic migraine. One is the calcium, other one is ATP, other one is sodium channel. This sodium channel gene mutations can have seizures associated with hemiplegic migraines. But clinically, we will not be able to differentiate between these 3 types based on the clinical symptoms. And usually the age of onset is 17 years. Only odd in this case was that the father at the age of 65 had hemiparesis with headache for the first time. And this is the most important thing, which I would like to take this poll question right now here. What are all the treatment options would you like to consider for a person who comes to you with history of hemiplegic migraine once you have confirmed the diagnosis? So the options are, we have to consider a prophylactic treatment after 2 attacks instead of 5 in the typical migraines. Beta blockers are the first choice as we use in migraine without aura. Valproate and lamotrigine is more effective than valproate when we use in these cases. And verapamil, flunarizine, acetazolamide can also be used for this kind of attacks. So answers, please. So see, the answer is equally divided between almost B, C, and D. The most important thing here is beta blockers and triptans and ergot derivatives should not be used in a case of hemiplegic migraine, because there's a controversy saying that beta blockers can prolong the aura and can lead to migrainous infarction. And even triptans and ergot derivatives are controversial for use in hemiplegic migraine. If you have more than 2 attacks in a month, you can straight away consider using prophylactic treatment. Valproate can be used for this treatment of hemiplegic migraine. But if you can combine valproate and lamotrigine, the effect is always better than valproate alone. You can use verapamil, you can use flunarizine, we can also use acetazolamide for treatment of this kind of attacks. So this lady had 3 types of symptoms. One, she had migraine with typical aura. She had a classical feature of familial hemiplegic migraine. She also had some kind of a tension type headache. So what I emphasize here is a given patient can have more than 1 type of headache in a given patient. So the most important thing for us is to keep a headache diary. So this headache diary is the one which helped us to clinch the diagnosis in this lady, where we could describe her attacks in the family as well as her. We could document the attacks in the family and the brother. And the father continued to have attacks after that, but the brother never had any attacks. This lady continued to have attacks. She was treated with valproate, and father also was treated with valproate. Both are doing well after valproate medication. Beta blockers was not used because of the controversy that they can prolong the prolong the attacks of aura in familial hemiplegic migraine. Why it is important for us to consider this? Because it has got prognostic significance. We need not investigate with hundreds of tests for stroke in young. It has got therapeutic decision because we have to prevent the next attack happening with appropriate medications, and we have to avoid complications. In fact, the second case which I showed, where we had thrombolized the case, he had used vasocrine for his headaches, and later on he had developed hemiplegic migraine, which the history was given later on when we digged into the detailed history. So these drugs can precipitate hemiparesis like presentation in hemiplegic migraines. So this I'll not go into the detail. To conclude, based on this, we made a diagnosis of familial hemiplegic migraine. This case has the importance that we can avoid unnecessary investigation. We can avoid thrombolysis. If a detailed history is taken, we can offer prophylactic treatment for patients who present with this kind of manifestations, and drugs like triptans, ergots, and beta blockers can be avoided to precipitate the attack. And the most important thing here we would emphasize is the headache diary is going to emphasize the diagnosis and prevent wrong diagnosis. Again, the red flags has to be ruled out. Primary headache is a diagnosis of exclusion once you rule out secondary headache, and diagnostic testing is not required in these patients who have got clear-cut history of family or hemiplegic migraine with headache happening on the contralateral side. Thank you very much for your patience hearing.
Sir, you have to Natar sir, you have to unmute.
Very interesting patient family of familial hemiplegic migraine. That's very interesting. And in fact, migraine could be a cause of late onset stroke of undetermined etiology, and also loss of consciousness. It could be DD for coma. So migraine has a lot of things to teach us. Any questions, please?
That's Shivakumar, one question now. Umashankar
Yes,
here.
sir.
One is you said about the beta blockers and contraindication in hemiplegic migraine. The same thing applies for migraine with ARA. When we do give, isn't it, in migraine with ARA?
So the myth is that whenever you have aura, we always think that when you give medicines during the time of aura, we can prevent the headache. Actually, in fact, the literature has shown that if you give medicines during aura, we are not going to prevent the headache happening. We have to give the preventive medication at the onset of headache. That's the first important thing. Second important thing is basilar migraine and hemiplegic migraine, beta blockers, triptans, and ergot derivatives should not be used. That is a controversy because they alter the cerebral autoregulation. That is particularly beta blockers called propranolol. They alter the cerebral vasoregulation. They might increase or sometimes lead to infarcts. So that is the reason we are supposed to not use beta blockers. We can use other drugs in spite of this.
Okay.
And I think we have one family like this. The minimal head injury, they'll go to coma. That
Yes.
is this migraine now. A small head injury, like just a tap on the head or a fall. I think that is how we picked up one elderly man had come with an altered sensorium after a trivial trauma, and all were negative. Then he recovered fully. Then his son also had a headache with right upper limb weakness, which used to improve. Then we have done it comes as a calcium channel. This one. So trivial headaches, and they will lose. They can go to coma.
Yeah, that is one of the important trigger factor in hemiplegic migraines. Even a small minor injury, they can have this kind of manifestation. In fact, the old man, the father of the patient, had a history which we did not, give importance at that time. When I reviewed the literature, then I realized that that was the reason for the trigger.
Shivakumar, this one about the patients who underwent, who got thrombolysis, who had, migraine with aura or hemiplegic migraine. So I think there was a study which showed out of around 230 patients, around 9% of the patients received thrombolysis, who were stroke mimics, out of which few were hemiplegic migraine. So, and if you see the thing, none of them had any complication. None of them had a bleed
Correct.
at all. I think the stroke is the one which will make them prone to thrombolysis. So even if you diagnose, sometimes it's difficult, especially if you're doing a thrombolysis using CT based. So you may miss out. MRI may be much more specific to pick up infarct. If you don't see infarct, maybe you may avoid thrombolysis. But CT sometimes very quickly, within few hours, it's difficult. So in the 9% of patients who received thrombolysis in stroke mimics, none of them had any complications. So that way, I don't think we are missing anything. So better to be careful, but
yeah. See, the problem happens when centers are using MRI for the basis of thrombolysis. So when someone comes with this, they have deficits, but MRI is normal. You are in a dilemma what to do.
Yeah.
So
I
that
think
is
we pick up
where
much more
considering.
stomach weakness.
Yeah. So whether to thrombolize or not, when someone has deficits, focal neurological deficits like a stroke, MRI is normal. What to do at that time, whether you thrombolize or not?
No, maybe you will spend more time in the sense, evaluate them. What is the history? I will
Yes.
probably repeat our diffusion next half an hour or so. I will probably rethink hyperglycemia, rule out much more investigations, labs and all. If you can access that, I'll probably repeat on diffusion in next half an hour again. If that diffusion picks up something, the deficit remains, then we'll go with thrombolysis. If the deficit is improving, you are treating a TIA. So
yeah, that AHA guidelines have come that is what the paper which has shown. Even if you thrombolize a mimic, you may not be wrong. So it is better, because waiting is a time, a stroke, we would always tell that time is brain. So this is one of the caveats where we can thrombolize, and it is approved also. It's a class, if indication is there, we can do that. We can protect ourselves. But so now on the hindsight will be this, and at that minute we have to take the decision. We will not be getting all the history of family, headache, migraine, and all those things. So you can thrombolize a mimic. but you should be careful. I have also thrombolyzed mimics who are, I think, alcoholic with a CT based because they were restless and all. So usually they don't bleed. It may be understatement, but usually they have not bled. So because there is nothing to lies there to bleed. If they have a old bleed or something, that can be.
Absolutely. I agree with that. So this is where we had thrombolyzed, we had thing. So I thought it's good we present here about this mimics, which can look like hemiplegic migraine where we thrombolyze.
We would have also done. I think we got some psychiatry patients, but as usual, they were changing. So some weakness used to be there, but you had a patient who had only on one side. That is odd for a psychogenic. I think we had in the initial, we had to go down and then think they are psychogenic. Otherwise, it's a thrombolysis. This all happens in the middle of the night. So yeah. We will not be having time.
Sure. Yeah, that was a very interesting presentation. Thank you, Dr. Shivkumar. Now we will go on to the next case presentation by Dr. Delon D'Souza, Assistant Professor of Neurology. She will be talking to us on COVID and headache. Dr. Delon.
Yes. Good evening, everyone. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, it's clear and audible.
Okay. So this is about coronavirus disease and headache. So we know that coronavirus, that is COVID-19, has not just had respiratory manifestations, but neurological manifestations as well. Some have been common, such as anosmia, ageusia, headaches, myalgias. Some more that are commonly seen are now increasing evidence of stroke, some uncommon, such as meningoencephalitis, encephalopathy, GBS, and so on, myositis. There are several mechanisms that have been put forward for the neurological manifestations of COVID. These include the direct entry of the virus into the CNS, either a para-infectious or post-infectious immune phenomenon, maybe a systemic effect of the illness or inflammation due to cytokine storm and severe illness. It could be secondary to hypoxia or complications of prolonged hospitalization. Now, the direct entry, there have been several theories that have been put forward, which include the axonal transmission route through the olfactory nerve cells and the transsynaptic spread and the retrograde spread of the virus from the nasal epithelial cells through the olfactory neurons. Or it could be the hematogenous spread, that is, once the lung capillaries are affected, it could pass on through the basement membrane into the blood circulation, and because of the increased permeability enter the CNS, or through the infected white blood cells like the Trojan horse mechanism. Now, coming to COVID headaches, headache is one of the most common symptoms associated with COVID-19 infection. It can be an inaugural and isolated symptom. The incidence of headache has been very a wide range, that is from 6.5% to 71%. And some meta-analysis had shown that the pool prevalence was about 14%. However, most of the studies were retrospective in nature. The initial studies just focused on the respiratory manifestations, the mortality data, and the true incidence of headache might have been underestimated. Recently, there were prospective studies that came mainly from Europe, and one such study had shown an evidence of headache as high as 68.3%. And there was very limited data from India about headache in COVID-19 patients. So we did a study in October 2020. As neurologists, most of us were pulled into the COVID consultant pool to do rounds, and this gave us an opportunity to study neurological manifestations in our COVID patients. And this was a real-time prospective study along with a comparative analysis with those without headaches, and all the consultants, as mentioned below, in the neurology department at St. John's were involved in the study. So materials and methods: COVID-19 patients admitted to St. John's Medical College Hospital, which is a tertiary care center in South India, in a period of 1 month were included, that is from October 1st to 31st. And COVID infection was confirmed in all patients from nasopharyngeal swabs with either RT-PCR or rapid antigen tests. The inclusion criteria: all COVID positive patients admitted who are above the age of 18 years. We excluded patients with altered sensorium, encephalopathy, meningitis, focal neurological deficits, and severe respiratory distress who were on a ventilator. A pre-designed questionnaire was used to collect demographic data, previous history of primary headache disorders, and headache characteristics. It included headache history, such as the onset, site, nature, duration, severity, and relationship with fever and other systemic symptoms. A numeric rating scale was used to rate the pain severity from 0 to 10, 0 no pain, 1 to 3 mild pain, 4 to 6 moderate, 7 to 9 severe, and 10 very severe. The site of headache, associated symptoms of photophobia, phonophobia, and nausea, vomiting were recorded. The details of previous headache history, if any, were recorded, and patients were classified as mild, moderate, and severe COVID infection as per the WHO guidelines. So the results, 225 patients were admitted to the acute COVID-19 care ward managed by the neurology team in about a month. In these patients, we found that 76 patients, that is almost 1/3, that is 33.8% of the patients had headaches. And if you can see the basic demographic data, you can see that the mean age was comparable, although patients with headaches were of a little younger age group, although not very significant. And although we know that COVID infection is more common in males, the number of patients when you see COVID-19 with headache, the number of female patients were higher compared to the number of male patients. Coming to the headache characteristics of these patients, considering the time of headache onset, that is considering their symptoms of generally fever, sore throat, or any other symptoms that heralded COVID-19 infection, most patients had headache at the onset of systemic symptoms, that is in 50 patients, 65.8. Others, most of them had between 2 to 5 days, or few between 6 to 10, and only one patient had beyond 10 days of symptom onset. The site of headache was bifrontal and holocranial in most of the patients, and few others described in bitemporal, hemicranial, occipital, or vertex. The nature of headache, it was mostly described as dull aching in majority of the patients. Few described it as throbbing, pulling sensation, and pressing in a few patients. The duration of headache. Now, most patients had a duration of headache that was less than 1 day or 1 to 5 days. Very few patients had for about 5 to 10 days, and about 14% had more than 10 days of headache. The severity of headache, according to the NRS scale, if you see that most of our patients had a moderate headache, they could give a score of about 4 to 6, and 25% had mild headache, and only 18.4% had severe headache. Interestingly, a past history of migraine was obtained in about 23.7% of the patients, that is in 18 patients, and past history of tension type of headache in 13.2%. But a majority of the patient had associated photophobia, phonophobia, and nausea. Both photophobia and phonophobia were seen in 8 patients, so almost about 55% of the patients. Comparing the COVID-19 infected patients with and without headaches. So if you see that most of the parameters were comparable, but we found that there was a higher incidence of sore throat, anosmia, ageusia, and myalgia in patients with headache, and these were statistically significant. Most others, there was not a significant difference. And if you looked at the comorbidities, they were also not very different in the two age groups, and nothing was statistically significant. But yes, a past history of primary headache disorders, such as migraine and tension type headache, was more common in patients with COVID-19 with headache. In fact, only one patient with migraine, previous migraine, did not have any exacerbation of his headache during COVID-19 infection, and 2 patients with previous history of tension type headache. If you look at the investigations, the significant investigations are the total WBC count was lower, the ferritin and the ESR was lower in patients with COVID-19 headache. So we identified headache in about 33.8%. Those with headaches were a little younger when compared with those without. It was more, though COVID-19 is more commonly in males, COVID-related headaches were more common in females. Most of the patients had headache at the onset of viral infection. Majority described it as dull aching or throbbing. It was holocranial or bifrontal in most. The headache intensity was either mild to moderate, whereas several other studies have described as moderate to severe. And COVID-related headache was short-lived in most patients and resolved completely within 5 days in the majority. Now, some of the interesting factors we found that there was a dissociation between the inflammatory markers and COVID headache. It was more common in patients without headaches, the inflammatory markers. And we consider that probably a direct activation of the trigeminal system was more probably the cause rather than systemic inflammation. Now, the associated symptoms as seen in migraine, many of the patients, even without those without migraine, had migrainous quality to their headache. Now, there is some evidence to show that there's coexistence of calcitonin gene-related peptide and angiotensin converting 2 enzyme receptors in the neurons of trigeminal ganglia. And also inflammatory cytokines like human necrosis factor alpha and interleukin 6, which are increased in a systemic viral infection, are known to increase CGRP. They have done multiple studies, especially animal studies, and they have found that there are a lot of links between TNF alpha and CGRP. That is, TNF receptors are present in majority of the CGRP containing neurons, and whenever the cultures are treated with TNF alpha, there is an increase in calcitonin gene-related peptide, and there is increase in CGRP promoter activity by TNF alpha. So probably the invasion of trigeminal nerve endings by SARS-CoV-2 along with an increase in inflammatory cytokines ultimately causes an increase in CGRP and produces an activation of trigeminal vascular system. So according to what the results we found, we could attribute this headache according to the ICD classification as a headache secondary to a systemic viral infection. Now, the systemic viral infection has been diagnosed. There's no evidence of meningitis or encephalitis. Here, however, majority of the patients do not have a neuroimaging or CSF. We have excluded patients with meningoencephalitis kind of presentation. The evidence of causation, that is headache developed in temporal relation, significantly worsening with worsening of systemic infection and improved or resolved in parallel with resolution of the systemic viral infection, it fulfilled this criteria. Headache had mostly the diffuse pain, moderate or severe. Most of our patients had mild to moderate headache. There is one study where they have specifically looked at mild to moderate COVID infection in Europe. In several countries, they have pulled in data, and they have done the study in about 1,420 patients. And here also the age group was much younger since they were mild to moderate, and they have found that headache is seen in about 70.3% of patients along with loss of smell and nasal obstruction. This was an interesting study where in Turkey, they have actually done a study in about 3,458 patients where all the patients who came with headache, irrespective of COVID-19 status, they were given a questionnaire. And in this COVID-19 positive were about 262 and patients without COVID-19 were 3,196. And in patients with COVID-19, new onset headache was seen in 33.2 and patients with previous headache were in 44.3. And no COVID diagnosis, new onset headache only in about 12%, and most of them were patients with previous headache. Now they found that in patients in headache, in patients with COVID-19 positive versus no COVID-19 positive, some of these characteristics were more classical in patients with COVID infection. That is the presence of anosmia ragusa, presence of a bilateral headache, poor response to analgesics, presence of gastrointestinal symptoms, more male gender in COVID-19 positive compared to non-COVID-19, headache duration of more than 72 hours. However, they have not given the confidence intervals in this study. So some of the other types of headache that we would like to highlight in COVID-19 is that there are a few literature that is mentioned, not many case reports or cases that have described this, where headache can develop after a week of illness, and this is probably due to the cytokine storm, and this is part of the multiple organ dysfunction that can occur. Now, the headaches can also occur due to other COVID-related neurological manifestations such as COVID-related strokes, meningoencephalitis, and edema. Headache could be also due to hypoxia. Now, some patients have described a tension-type headache due to anxiety and stress. A minority of the patients had primary cough headache. A few patients and healthcare professionals have described headache due to the use of mask, which is a band-like or pulling sensation seen predominantly in the frontal region. There is one such study that has been done in Singapore where doctors or healthcare workers who had to wear personal protection equipment such as N95 mask and protective eyewear were interviewed through a questionnaire, and out of 158 respondents, up to 81% developed de novo PPE associated headaches. A pre-existing primary headache diagnosis and a combined PPE usage of more than 4 hours per day was independently associated with de novo PPE associated headaches. So these are some of the studies, and you can see that most of the studies have shown a very not a very high prevalence, but because most of them were retrospective, they did not look at specific headache in COVID patients. The studies where they were prospective and had headache questionnaires and looked at headache specifically definitely showed a higher incidence, but most of them showed about 13%, about 11%, and 6%. And also the interesting fact is that the studies from Europe showed a higher prevalence of headache compared to studies from Asia. There could be several reasons. Again, the studies from Europe were generally prospective, where the headache incidence was higher. Is it a genetic difference or a difference in the viral mutations or viral manifestations is not very clear. So the take-home message is that COVID-19 related headaches occur as an early manifestation of COVID-19 infection in a significant proportion of patients. Recognition of headache as an important early symptom of COVID-19 will give us an opportunity for early isolation and treatment of COVID-19 infected persons during this pandemic. Anosmia and agusia are commonly associated with headaches, and COVID-related headache is usually short-lived and carries a benign prognosis in most patients. These are my references. Thank you. So you're muted, sir.
Did you do a survey in non-COVID patients in your OPD? You have shown that the Turkey patient, they had 10 to 11% of non-COVID patients have headache. We have seen that there is something called COVID syndrome in the general population itself. Even without being infected by COVID, we have had a lot of tension type headaches brought on by anxiety due to COVID. Did you do a survey in your OPD patients without COVID infection?
Unfortunately, we did not use a control group without COVID infection. So the study was mainly, we were in the COVID ward, so we did between patients who had headache and did not have headache. But yes, definitely we did see an increase in tension type headache and anxiety in our OPDs as well.
How many doctors in your group had headaches?
I think almost all of us had with the mask and with the face shields. Definitely on an OPD.
I do get headaches. I have migraine, so we're suffering a lot with masks. So
now PP headache, mask headache will come. So
yeah.
So is it a primary or some other IST class? To the one new class will come. 9 point or something they will have to give now.
A lot of patients with migraine do have headaches on wearing specs.
Yeah.
Because of the pressure on the ear. So maybe something like that, the mask headaches.
What do you advise, Dr. Nadan? Good presentation. What do you advise people with mask-induced headaches? So take frequent breaks, take excessive coffee. So what do you advise?
I think it's an occupational hazard. So taking frequent breaks, especially in an OPD, is not really possible. I think a headache is better than a COVID-19 infection.
Exactly.
So a mild headache, most people have. So yes.
Yeah.
Because we have seen quite a increased amount of migraine. People who already have migraine wearing mask. I had one lady today, similar thing. So there is unexplained increase in her headaches. Her routine, we ask for any triggers, well controlled. Quite physically active, and so that's the only thing which has changed is wearing mask. So probably it has now increased the amount of headaches now we're seeing people.
I always use this mask which I can tie, so that reduces the headache. So I can't wear the mask what you are wearing, Guru. Some adjustments.
That answers the thing, because this is much more in a hospital setting. This is much more protective because it tightens over the nose. The one which you wear with the band over the ears is quite a little loose. So it's okay to be at home while wearing that, but when you are in the hospital,
not in the home at OPDs.
Yeah.
I think there are no questions.
Because I think so COVID has related to so many headaches now. I think there is a anosmia which has got more migraine. If you think that is statistically significant, which gives an indirect evidence to say that that the trigeminal vascular system, so the neuronal direct neuronal injury to the that could be another explanation. I find that statistically, it is a very small study. Statistically, who had anosmia had more headaches compared to other people.
The trigeminal vascular system may be affected, but there has been recently published autopsy study of 15 patients of COVID, where these German investigators did not find evidence of COVID infection inside the brain. Okay.
They
So it
didn't
is
find,
whatever
yes.
it is metabolic or toxic, what the brain suffers.
Other
They did find some microhemorrhages, I think, so in the frontal lobe and medial frontal, though they
Yeah,
didn't
it's
find the virus.
toxic or metabolic, systemic, because of the viral infection.
The other thing is because she was showing that statistically the parameters like LDH, ferritin were not high in patients who had headaches in the first week compared to the non-COVID COVID patients who didn't have headache, where inflammatory markers are high. So that is where how this headache has caused. So I have seen in OPDs who have who had become COVID, whose migraine has resolved. They have a recurrence of migraine attacks. I have some few patients. So then I could tell them this is there. We have done that, and then it will really soothes them that it is not infected to the brain. So one take-home message is in a known migrainer, headache concept who are very controlled. If headache has recurred back, if one could say that it could be a starting of a COVID. I don't know. So, so maybe so many other causes, but it is better to, in a neurology OPD, at least we can tell that you have to be careful on COVID, at least for the doctors also. If
Raghu, they are spending more time at home. They have more headaches.
No, another indirect thing, what has made headaches before doing COVID is that lack of exercise. Who've been regularly exercising, over years, and suddenly they are not. Some people are, used to exercises outdoors. So it is now, they are limited with that. So they have increased their weight. The weight gain has happened, then increased OSA, and headaches have become much more common. And I think that's one way of looking at indirectly.
I think, like Dr. Umashankar said, there have been increased incidence of marital problems because of COVID caused confinement to the home. Okay, assaults, divorces, and all that. So there is a lot of different types of stress because of this COVID infection.
Yes.
I think we started with COVID and we are coming to the end with the COVID with headache. We started with COVID with neurological manifestation. If I remember.
Raghu, and there was a lot of headache for you during COVID times.
Yeah, no, sir. It was so Guru Prasad, everyone
good headache to have.
Shiv Kumar, Amit, everyone has helped us in organizing. I think we have a good, participants. I think every time, definitely there were more than around 100 used to be participate, and it was good. And most of I think we have involved many doctors from across the Karnataka and all senior consultant as chairperson. And it was a good experience having these webinars.
If there are no other questions or anything, I thank Dr. Nataraj for chairing this session, the last session for this year at least, this COVID season rather, I'll put it that way. And thank you,
We're
sir.
taking a summer vacation.
Thank you.
We're just taking a summer vacation.
Yeah.
IPL vacation. IPL vacation and come back after the summer. I thank all my BNET teammates. Dr. Raghu, Guru, Shiva is here, and Rajesh was there earlier. So thank you all for, putting so many seminars together. It was nice, and so many people to participate here. And I also thank the pharma today. Sun Pharma has sponsored this program, and the Hallmark team, as usual, they have been helping us a lot. So thank you all. So hope to see you soon after the IPL.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.